Started. Thank you all for joining us bright and early. Today we're talking about galvanizing growth. The context to this is the Institute's work on innovative finance that we do. So I'm Caitlin McLean. I'm an associate director here at the Milken Institute. And throughout the year, we do a series of what we call financial innovations labs, which are one part research, one part convening, and one part reporting, where we try to address market failures or capital gaps, really looking at economic development. And as a theme, I'm sure, as you've seen throughout this conference, that as you look at global macro trends, it really is the emerging markets and the frontier markets that are driving this global growth. And so, how do you leverage public sector funding and philanthropic funding to attract private investment in these markets that might be perceived as too risky, certainly the frontier markets, as too risky without having some sort of public sector incentive or philanthropic incentive. And so at the Milken Institute, we help partners think through new ideas to come up with different financial or policy programs to try to incentivize this private sector engagement. And we look across sectors and we look across countries. And we're very pleased today to have this panel put together because these are all participants that we have had at previous financial innovations labs, again looking at a variety of different sectors. So I'm just going to introduce the panelists very quickly because you have their bios in your programs, and we want to make sure to have enough time to have an actual discussion. So I'll just start. All the way to my left here is Craig Courtney from Tamarack Partners, Carrie Stever from Eris, David Ferreira to my right here from Gavi, Alice Albright from the Global Education Partnership, and all the way at the end, Larry Coben from the Sustainable Preservation Initiative. And so, as I mentioned, each of the panelists represent a sector or an organization that is really working to invest in human capital and invest in economic development in these emerging and frontier markets. And that's particularly important, as I said, if the folks in the back can pull up slide 6 that we have, and you'll see a lot of these throughout the conference, is really looking at how much growth and how much of the global macroeconomic sustainability is going to be driven from the emerging and frontier markets. And so as you look at that, you have to think about investing now in their infrastructure, in human capital, in making sure that there is economic diversification in these countries. And another interesting aspect to that, especially from the Milken Institute's perspective, if you pull up slide 8, is looking at specifically at the human capital and looking at, this is Africa's labor force, projected to become the largest by 2035. And so if you think about, how you promote productivity in a country, there are certain challenges right now that are facing these populations, and it's fine to think that they are faraway problems and they are problems that don't affect developed countries, but in fact they do. And they are going to affect the kind of macro global trends for decades to come. So we'd like to kick it off today, and I'm going to throw it to Carrie here to talk about why investing in human capital, and especially looking at health in these countries, why that matters, and how it can actually be a social return and a financial return at the same time. So Carrie, why don't you kick it off? We're going to have a video.
Yep. So first, I just want to say thanks to Milken. I think I've been part of this Financial Innovations Lab now for a year, and there's been a lot of great ideas that we've been able to test and push forward, and I think we need to continue to have that, your convening power, your thought leadership really in this area. We need to keep innovating with financial products as much as we are with anything else in the world, whether it's health or sustainability. And so just grateful that you keep pushing the envelope forward on these important issues. So we'll start with that. And second, I just want to thank everybody for showing up at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we're going to talk about tuberculosis, which is not a really upbeat issue at 8 a.m. But I thought instead of presenting a lot of data, I would just show you a short trailer that talks a little bit about the epidemic and then how we're looking at this from a funding perspective and a financial perspective. If you want to go with that.
90 years ago, we thought we had our answer to tuberculosis. The world's first TB vaccine. Then, a new drug. Our cure. Then, we got complacent. Now, we have a global epidemic. Airborne, contagious, deadly, and evolving into a superbug that's getting even harder and harder to treat. We're more exposed now than ever before.
MDR-TB is not like normal tuberculosis. I was resistant to 7 drugs. I can remember moments during treatment and thinking, I can't do this anymore. I don't know that I'll make it through this.
Every clinician is aware of the need for a newer vaccine, but then there's no option.
We must maintain this momentum because otherwise it will put us back decades, actually.
I'm appalled at the level of our complacency.
The number of people that have drug-resistant tuberculosis is going up, and nobody's talking about it.
How can I sit back when every 5 minutes a child is dying of TB? It would be criminal.
What we've got to do is not say, oh, we're going to make this a little better. We've got to essentially transform the entire field.
Hopefully that didn't scare you completely.
No, actually, fear is a great motivator.
Yes.
But I think that one of the things that we did with tuberculosis is really say the way that we thought about this disease early on was it's a neglected disease, it's a poverty-driven disease, and therefore there's no market. And what we needed to do is take a step back and say, what is this epidemic really teaching us today, and then how are we looking to finance ultimately getting rid of it? And so what we do have is a very, very serious epidemic with drug resistance now, with the most extreme cases reported in 84 countries, including the US, and every European country, Japan, you name it, we've got it. So how are we going to underwrite the development of vaccines, ultimately, that would protect people from getting this disease? So if we can go to slide number 37. Keep going forward. There you go. What we did is we worked with, we put together probably the most sophisticated model of the market and the epidemic from a public health perspective to say, how do we maximize both the public health returns that we're seeking as well as the financial? And so we built a model with data from 183 countries, and we looked at tiered pricing models. We looked at, we did some early market analysis on who would purchase these vaccines, what the pricing sensitivities were, and our most conservative estimates, and this has been vetted with most of the major pharmaceutical companies and many of the countries in the world that will be targeting to purchase this vaccine when it's available, was a 13 to 14 billion 10-year market, which really is opening up a lot of different ideas in the way that we think about underwriting the cost of R&D. So if we can help incentivize industry, and I'm in a product development partnership model, which is a nonprofit biotech, and we're never going to commercialize, and that's not why we really got started in this business. We got started because people said there's no market, and we need these nonprofits to come together to sort of help galvanize the science and move it forward. Now we're sitting here with this new data, and we're saying what's not only the role of the nonprofit sector or the PDPs like ERIS, but how do we really get industry, governments, and other stakeholders who are critical to unlocking the potential of capturing this market really to act. So if you go to the next slide, number 38. For the last year, we have been working with the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, on number one, first putting the model together, and two, really looking at how we break down the finance. And what we realize, and this is something that's been pivotal to the conversations we've had in the Innovations Lab, which is it's not really that innovative finance is the answer, or we don't have to take a one-size-fits-all. We need to look at the system, the value chain, and break it down and say, where do all these key stakeholders have a role to play? So we said, you governments, we know there are austerity measures, we know that this is a difficult environment. We want you to really play more of a catalytic role, de-risk this process for industry. And then industry, we know there's a market on that side. Let's help you actually galvanize that, get that market. And we're going to ask you to put more money in to the more expensive phases of R&D. And through this process, we reduce the money that we actually need to raise, and we help to optimize both the doing good while you're able to earn capital. And we've vetted this now with several of the governments, all the major multinationals who are involved in TV R&D and those that aren't, and this is incentivizing them really to come forward and put more of their own funding into it. This is how I think when we think about creative ways to approach development, we first have to break it down and ask the most important questions, which is, have we really thought about where private and public funding come in, and how you optimize really on getting the public funds to be more catalytic, and not really think about the ideas that poverty or disease or any issue you're really trying to combat globally is necessarily just write a check from your charitable donation.
Right, that's important. And I think it's important to understand that there is this investment case. I think certainly, as you've talked about, there is this perceived risk versus what some of the actual risk is. And I think the simulation that you guys have run certainly demonstrates that some of that might be perceived and not actual. So I wanted to throw it to Craig because part of this is also looking at what the actual funding structure, finance structure is. And there are people, obviously panelists here that represent very innovative ways to use finance. And this is across sector. So Carrie was talking about health. Craig has been working for a variety of sectors, but in looking at agriculture, which is certainly for Africa in particular, a very important sector. And you've been able to, as Carrie was mentioning, kind of advertise this investment case enough so that the governments and the private sector have been able to come in, perhaps on a small scale now, but potentially at a larger scale later. So can you talk about some of the models that you've used?
Yeah, no, once again, thanks for Caitlin, thanks for letting myself, as the founding member of Tamarack Partners, we advise international organizations, development organizations, on how to improve their development outcomes by using their, most often, public-private foundation grant funding and blending that with investment capital, really to improve their development outcomes, and advise organizations in the agricultural sector, the health sector, financial inclusion. But what I'd like to do is talk about one of our other organizations that we've worked with that's involved in improving food and nutrition security. So if I could have slide 29. What I'd like to emphasize, given that my background is in investment banking for 25 years, is that you're going to hear different financial instruments from different people on the panel here. You're going to hear about securitization instrument that's investable. You've heard about a first loss instrument that hopefully will have some investable tranche to it. You're going to hear about a private equity model as well. And then I'm going to explain to you about a private equity and private debt, these are models that can use blended capital, blues, grants, and blend that with investment monies. And that's what we're here about. And so what we have here, what you'll see here is basically the theory of change that we see within the food and nutrition security sector. And it's literally that we set out the burden on the slide and the number of people suffering from malnutrition and causes stunting, wasting, really among women of childbearing age and very young children. At the same time, there's the food industry, and from seed to table has a big influence on the amount of the food and the food and commodities that are produced globally, and so they have an important they're an important actor in this. When they look at the market, particularly at the base of the pyramid populations, where incomes are very limited per day, there are a number of constraints that are there in terms of them accessing capital. The margins for a food company from seed to table are much smaller than for a vaccine company. So when you look at bringing a product to market, I run the IRR on some smaller packet project, product yogurt product, whatever it might be, and I'll look at that and it'll come up negative NPV. I don't invest if I'm a food company. So what I need to do is, what we need to do is de-risk that front end of that investment and help create demand, help basically shape markets for them. And so what GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, does is work with the private, public, and the NGO sector to pursue projects, innovative kind of sustainable models. And one of those, to encourage the private sector, is to have capital, different types of capital available. So it'd be debt, equity, guarantee structures. So if we can move to the next slide, 30. What we see is the supply chain from seed to table. It's basically seed companies, fertilizer companies, distribution, warehousing, producing and production, process, all the way through to distribution. Within that, they all need different types of capital. So this is basically in value chain, investable value chain that needs debt, equity, guarantee structures. If we can move to, so what GAIN decided was, what we are as a sector expert, we know what products and what services will impact that people consume those products, fortified or iodized salt or fortified foods, that it'll reduce wasting and reduce stunting and improve their livelihoods. So what we've done is we partnered with best-in-class financial institutions, so the IFC, some social impact investor organizations like Acumen, like Root Capital, all of which provide different types of capital. Some are guarantee structures, like factoring, some are private equity structures, some are larger kind of structured finance, different sizes of assets as well as different products. But we provide the sector expertise, the knowledge around what products work. So we created those partnerships, much like an investment bank has sector teams and then product teams. It's similar, very similar structure. We made these partnerships. We made a number of investments over the years. These investments have yielded high single-digit, low double-digit returns, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And what we are now doing, if you'll turn to slide 33, is we're working with one of our existing partners, LGT, based out of Zurich, and we're launching a social impact fund. And what this is we will make investments along the value chain in ag and food security. And basically, it's a private equity, private debt fund. It has one arm of it is a technical assistance facility, which will be funded by public and private foundation monies, which is where GAIN provides its sector expertise to the companies. Like what is the right product formulation, what is the right packaging, et cetera, what are the right marketing strategies you can use to reach those populations. That won't affect the financial returns that are open to investors, and that's the investment fund. And that will mainly be private equity and private debt. And we're looking for a first close towards the end of this year, early next year. We've already received a commitment from CDC, part of the development, DFID, the UK development arm, kind of anchor funding commitment. So now we're looking for investors. And at the end of the day, it's an investment in the food sector, in the food supply chain, to the broadest sense in Africa. And our impact, we're looking to impact, the impact indicators are around stunting and wasting in the first instance on the nutrition side, and on the food security side, it's around impacting the quality and the quantity of the food, therefore impacting the yields of crops and the small and medium-sized farmer livelihoods. So those are the impact metrics, and talk about later.
And you would say, I mean, the critical part of the component of structuring this was the government involvement, was the CDC involvement, certainly, and the commitment there, kind of attracting the private sector, but also, their commitment demonstrated by the fact that there was private sector commitment as well.
Yeah.
Sort of back and forth.
Yeah, no, it's back and forth. We have a pipeline of companies in this region, and through the net, we being GAIN. And LGT has a network of investment professionals in the region. So there are private companies that have projects that are investable. They're looking for investment. Of course, the private company will take a grant anytime you want to give it to them. I mean, but at the end of the day, that's not what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a sustainable solution where investment capital can be recycled and used over and over and again as it is, and try to basically de-risk each other. What's the risk of giving a grant to get an outcome of reduced stunting? There's a risk involved there. At the same time, there's a risk in investing in the company that the product will be successful and produce a financial return. So what you want to do is de-risk each other investments, right? So both those packages, pots of monies, funds will de-risk each other's investments. So you'll get the social return for the investor that's looking at Gates Foundation, DFID, and you'll get the financial return for the institutional pension fund and foundation investors as well.
Exactly, and I think there's certainly the public sector component of that and the incentive there, especially as we look at the austerity measures, as Carrie was mentioning, and the smaller and smaller pot available to fund these types of programs that you need to get much more leverage, much more bang for your buck in this case. And so that brings me to Alice, who spent many decades actually looking at how to make government aid effective and more efficient. And so Alice, how do you think, where are the trends now in terms of what the government can do, certainly from your experience at Export-Import Bank, of really using funding to incentivize, small investment in small businesses, medium-sized businesses. How have you seen that kind of play out in trends currently?
Just make sure this is on. Well, first of all, let me thank you for including me. I always come back from the Milken conferences inspired and enthusiastic, so it's a great pleasure to be here. You've asked a very interesting question, and I think, and I've been at my current job now for about 2 months, but I had been with the Obama administration in the first term as the Chief Operating Officer of the Export-Import Bank. And before that, I was at Gavi for 8 years. In fact, David now has my job. Thank goodness. But I think that it's safe to say that the world, if you were to compare and contrast the time when Gavi was basically started, which was in 2001, 2000, to now, the world could not be more different in terms of how governments are looking at their funding, obviously. What is the role of aid? What is the role of the private sector? Where does resources have to come from? What is sustainable? The other whole side of the equation, too, is that risk appetite in the private capital markets has completely changed relative to what it was. And so those two factors, plus economic weakness in almost every setting that you can think of, with a few exceptions, or increasing economic weakness, has made the whole question of how do you fund things to be completely a whole different level of question. So I'm going to talk about two different types of financial innovation. One, in fact, is the Export-Import Bank, which is in many ways, it is not an aid agency. It's a very important thing to understand, and has a whole level different approach to the question of sustainability. And then I'll talk about my current endeavor, which is funding education in the poorest countries. So in terms of the question of sustainability, it's important to understand that the Export-Import Bank is not an aid agency, okay? In fact, it is completely self-funded, and it returns is the wrong word. It actually gives money back to the federal government every single year, which is used for deficit and debt reduction. In fact, this past September 30th, with one stroke of a click on a computer, we sent $1 billion to the Treasury. And so we are completely, Ex-Im Bank was completely funded by the fees that it charges. It's a very interesting model, and I think it's a model of social innovation that is worthy of trying to replicate in other areas, like in particular something that could be looked at as a domestic infrastructure bank. But Ex-Im Bank was started, just to give you a tiny bit of background, it was started by FDR in 1934. And it started also in the midst of a depression and started to finance the sale of silver ingots to Russia. And it's been in business ever since, and it has developed a deep talent to finance exports of goods and services, but principally goods, out of the United States. It has been particularly relevant over the last few years because of the sort of twin impact of financial market weakness. I mean, a lot of the typical players in export finance are no longer doing it, and that, the French banks, for example, have, largely, not exited is a strong word, but have pulled back quite substantially. Regulatory changes have meant taking, different types of banking assets on your balance sheet as being a very different type of calculus because of the capital costs that are now associated with Basel III, for example. But Ex-Im Bank itself is the largest export credit agency of the OECD. One of the interesting things that I found out, I didn't know much about the export credit world when I got there, but the amount of money that flows through all of these export credit agencies is substantial. And is a source of capital to buyers of goods of all these countries that a lot of people in the know don't really know about. I was sort of stunned by the level of money that flows through. So Ex-Im Bank, in terms of its footprint, it's only about 404 people, or it was when I left 2 months ago. It has an $108 billion balance sheet. Last year it did $38 billion of business. One of the pieces of business that it did was a $5 billion loan to a petrochemical plant in the Middle East. So it can put huge amounts of money into projects overseas where the capital markets are just simply not prepared to fund them. Exim Bank will finance all different parts of an export transaction, starting with small businesses and suppliers to major U.S. exporters, many of which are here, to buyers of U.S. exports. And so it can really be quite, have quite kind of a leveraging effect on outcomes. One of the things that I worked on when I was there, it was tiny, but it was important, was specifically a program to finance small business exporters who weren't getting access to capital in the domestic markets because banks, I'm talking like $350,000, I mean microfinance basically. But banks who have become increasingly wholesale have decided that a $350,000 loan is just simply not worth the operating costs involved. So I put together a program to lend $500,000 and below to small business exporters to improve their access to opportunities. But the outcome of Exim Bank, and I'm now just very much summarizing, is it operates at no cost to the taxpayer. It promotes and sustains the creation of U.S. jobs. In the final year that was there, we created 270,000 jobs. And it is an investment in what I call a level playing field for U.S. exporters in their ability to compete with foreign companies who get typically a lot greater in the way of support, subsidization, and things like that from their own governments. So it's a very interesting model. Let me now turn to Global Partnership for Education, where I started a couple months ago. GPE is the only global partnership that finances education in the poorest countries of the world. We do that now in 55 countries. It's an opt-in model, and we put out about between $350 and $400 million a year. That number will go up, if I look at our projections. We're talking some of the most challenging environments in the world: Afghanistan, Haiti, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia. I'm going off next week or in a few weeks' time to Africa, and I'll be going to Liberia and Senegal. So these are countries that are barely have really functional education systems, or if they're in a post-conflict situation, no education system. Our business model is based on the idea that rather than doing sort of one-off projects which are not sustainable, like sending a few books to a certain school, what we really need to work on is systemic change, because that is sustainable. And so we work with the ministries of education in all of these countries to help them design good education programs, sectoral change, to try to get them to get more girls into school, get more kids into school, get better teachers, get better teaching materials. The whole idea is system-wide change. And we're a partnership, so we're able to bring in, on our board, we have sort of one of everybody who is really the major players in education. And that's something that I think we can do more of, which is to really motivate all these players to get involved with the countries. In terms of a form of social investment, it's very different than some of the stuff we're talking about here, but all the statistics would indicate that investments in education at the primary level generate some of the highest social outcomes. It is underlying to all other good things happening in other sectors, like health, like preparedness for climate change, security issues, food security issues, a lot of things we're talking about here. So it is got high potential in terms of social investment. The concern about it is that relative to some of the other things we've talked about is that the results do not happen overnight. And so it's been harder to attract the attention to the area that some of the other endeavors do have. But nonetheless, I often like to ask the question, well, if you're looking at returns and outcomes, we know that the cost of education is high, but the cost of not education is a lot higher. So in terms of a social endeavor, I think it's very persuasive. Let me stop there, because I know you want to get on to others, but I could certainly give more comments about financial innovation generally speaking. But let me turn it back over to you.
No, that's great, and I think it leads nicely to David, because it's really talking about, again, this sort of leverage factor of how you can use government funding. And David can talk to you a little bit about Gavi's story and about how they've been able to actually engage the more traditional capital markets because of having this the support and the backing of public sector funding. So David, you want to talk about that?
Thanks, Caitlin, and to our Milken friends, Glenn, Caitlin, Aaron, and others, thanks a million for having me here. I think one of the great things about being here, the greatest thing about being here is the group of people that you attract, I think. And so I very much hope we get the chance to hear some feedback from you guys in the room on the stuff we're talking about during the session, and then afterwards. I'll be around drinking lots and lots and lots of coffee, so please find me at the bar. So my slides start on 9, guys, and perhaps just to start with Gavi. Gavi stands for Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and in a nutshell, we try to get the vaccines that our kids get in rich countries out to the poorest countries of the world and to all of the kids in those countries. We work in 73 countries, including all the difficult ones that Alice mentioned. Vaccines matter. Vaccines matter because, first of all, as we sit here today, there are 1.7 million kids a year who die from vaccine-preventable diseases. In other words, they die for no good reason. There's a cheap, effective technology that can save their lives. And almost all of those kids are in the poorest countries of the world. They're not dying in the US or the UK or France. As education is important for health, so health is important to education. And part of the reason why we immunize our kids is not just so that they don't die, but so that they can live healthy lives and so that they can actually attend school, take in information much more effectively, be productive, and ultimately it has a very, very big impact on disposable income, on economic growth, and so on. So vaccination really matters, and it matters in a global context. So Gavi is a true public-private partnership. Our board is public and private, we work in a way that aims to achieve rolling out vaccines to the poorest parts of the planet, but doing that in a sustainable way. So on the one hand, we work with vaccine manufacturers to assure prices and volumes and quality that are all appropriate and affordable. And on the other hand, we work with developing countries on the implementation of vaccination programs, but also on the financing. So every single Gavi vaccine, every vaccine that we fund, is co-financed by the countries that implement the vaccination programs, including, North Korea, Democratic Republic of Congo, and so on. They pay a part of the price of the vaccines, and as they grow economically, they pay a bigger and bigger proportion until they get to $1,550 GNI per capita when they graduate out of the system. So it's a developmental model and aims at this long-term sustainable vaccination market that works globally, not just in rich countries. And so the good news is that it's working. There's a long way to go, but it's working. So basic immunization coverage in the countries that we work in, Gavi's been around for 12 years. When you think of things like DTaP and a few other basic vaccines, that coverage is now up at 80%. Still means 20% are uncovered, but 80% is a high number compared to where we came from. We're aggressively rolling out the new generation vaccines, so against diseases that kill a lot of kids in developing countries, like pneumonia, like diarrhea, kill very few kids in rich countries, but we have the vaccines to prevent those diseases in large part. And overall, you probably know that one of the good news stories in global development and global health is that infant mortality has come off, partly as a result of increased global immunization, from where it was over 12 million in the year 1990 to where it's under 7 million now, with a much bigger denominator, obviously, as population has grown. So I wanted to talk to you about a couple of the ways that we do our business. So I wanted to talk about 2 programs that we have, one of which is a true financing instrument, and we can go on to slide 10. And then I'm going to talk about an instrument which is much more about giving meat to the public-private partnership after this. This is IFIM, the International Finance Facility for Immunization. Alice has heard about it before. She was around at the founding when she occupied my seat at Gavi. And I said to Caitlin this morning, often very difficult to explain IFIM to people, but not to this crowd. To this crowd, very straightforward, which is that we have a bunch of donors, and you see them up there on the screen, who have provided us with a schedule of committed payments. So they legally contracted to provide us with, X dollars in 2013, Y dollars in 2014, et cetera, sometimes 20 years out. Pari passu obligations, and we use those assets, we securitize those assets in the bond market. So we issue bonds, AA+ rated in markets across the world. We've done benchmarks in US dollars, in sterling, in Aussie dollars, and then a lot in the Japanese retail market, in the so-called Yurodashi market in Japan, to retail investors. Happy to talk more about that. But we can go on to, and that's it. That's happy to come back to IFM, but I think you get that. What it allows us to do is that we've got predictable funding, so we can do very potent deals with vaccine manufacturers because we're around to stay. We can also provide credibility to the implementing countries that we work with. And it also provides us with flexibility, so we can use the money when it is needed from a public health perspective, rather than when the check happens to be in the mail from the donor. And we'll talk about the impact a little bit later. So on to slide 11. This is a very different instrument, the Gavi Matching Fund, but I thought it would be very interesting to some of the folks here. A couple of years ago, we asked ourselves how we could really up the ante on getting the private sector right into the heart of what Gavi does in all of the operations and the challenges that we face, which I think in this crowd want to understand intuitively why that's awfully important for an organization like us that's trying to do the job we're doing. And so the UK government and the Gates Foundation helped us. They gave us $130 million between the two of them, which is available to match private contributions to Gavi, whether those come from companies, foundations, or otherwise, on a dollar-for-dollar basis. And so the way that it works is that if company X gives $10 to Gavi, the matching fund will double that. But if an employee or a member or a customer or whatever of company X gives $1 to Gavi, that will also be matched. And the contribution to Gavi can come in cash, which it typically does, but it also can come in kind. And so it was set up to bring in money from the private sector, but also to bring in core business skills, and also to get help with spreading the message about the importance of global immunization through the constituencies of these partners. So far we have 9 partners, and we can, when we talk about impact, I can tell you about how that's worked out to date. But it's certainly an incredibly exciting program, which we launched in June 2011, so it's still pretty new, but going very nicely. So on slide 12, we can talk a little bit about IFM. IFM, the nominal value of the long-term government pledges to IFM is $6.3 billion. Off the back of that, we've raised $3.85 billion in the various markets to date. And IFM has already given Gavi $2.2 billion of that money to spend largely on vaccines, and in some cases on strengthening health systems to facilitate immunization. And the results have been extraordinary. There was an independent evaluation, which I quote there, in 2011, which, based on the fact that IFM enabled us to rapidly accelerate the rollout of vaccines in countries where coverage was very low across the planet, and to spend the money at the right time rather than waiting 20 years, has really had a very significant positive impact on global health. So slide 13, I guess, lucky number 13. On the Gavi Matching Fund, so far from the 9 partners, we have a target of 260 million. By the way, the target for the end date of this matching fund is end 2015. So the target is to raise 260 million by the end of 2015. So far, we've raised 88 million. I think equally importantly, we've really got some significant value-added partnerships. So there are, I can mention 2. The one is on the previous slide. You saw some guys with red noses. For those of you who've been in Britain around Comic Relief time, Comic Relief is one of our partners. They've given us a lot of money. But I think at least equally importantly, during Comic Relief Week, when they have telethon on BBC over the weekend, massive exposure, 12 million viewers this year. A lot of the footage there this year was about immunization and about Gavi, and a lot of what drove the public's giving to Comic Relief was about immunization. That's what the statistics tell us. And so getting the message out there to that public, which after all is also the public that is the taxpayer of the UK government that gives us a lot of money, is very important for various reasons. Vodafone, just to mention, we've launched a very exciting program with them. Their contribution to us is in kind, because we really needed the services that they can provide and companies like they can provide. So we've launched a program in Mozambique, which is about the Mozambican government and Vodafone and ourselves using their technology and their systems to record births, to record immunizations, to monitor stock levels and control, to do social mobilization, to bring people to the clinics at the right time to be vaccinated, etc. And if that works out in Mozambique, and we have set benchmarks we'd like to reach, we will then take it to several other countries that we have in the pipeline with Vodafone. So finally, slide 14, just to give you guys something to think about, and to give people like my friend Andrew Taylor from Grand Challenges something to chew on. You know, one of the issues that intrigues me, and that I'd love to hear from you folks on, is whether we can launch a results-based type of instrument around immunization. So, for example, one of the new vaccines that we're just launching now is HPV, human papilloma virus, which against human papilloma virus, which causes cervical cancer. And we have very specific targets to reach 1 million girls by the end of 2015 and to reach 30 million by the end of 2020. So you could say, you know, is there an investor, whether that be a true commercial investor or whether that be a foundation type investor, a PRI type investor, that would say, I'll take a view, I will invest in an instrument that gives me a payback that depends on that, you know, how close you get to that outcome. And I'm prepared to take a view on that. And you then have, on the flip side, a funder, like a government donor, who is very interested in paying for results only, who will then fund that payout at the time. And indeed, we could do this as a standalone instrument, or a variation on the theme is that we could use IFM, which is an existing program that we have out there, but flip the model. So for example, you could have an investor that invests in an IFM bond, but says, look at, you know, if certain health outcomes are reached, polio transmission is interrupted in 2014, then I will forgive all or part of the principal or coupon on that. So just something I would love to brainstorm with you folks, and in a sense, the holy grail. So thank you very much.
Of course, yeah. No, I think that brings up, and we can certainly talk about that model, especially as it relates to scale. Certainly for the folks in the audience who are familiar with the social impact bond model, there have definitely been questions about the scalability of the model itself, which is interesting considering that the Gavi has been extremely successful in promoting innovative finance at a much larger scale than most can. So looking more at a microfinance, micro level, Larry Coben, all the way at the end there, last but not least, works on cultural heritage and cultural preservation. And just as some context there, the Milken Institute has done a series of our labs looking at how you generate revenue and really find revenue streams for communities that have a lack of resources in terms of how you think of traditional resources, but have tremendous cultural resources. So Larry, why don't you talk a little bit more about how you've been able to work maybe at a micro level, but to still have the impact in terms of the social and financial return.
Sure, thanks Caitlin, and thank you for inviting me. I've been to several of these labs that Caitlin mentioned with Glenn and Caitlin, as well as labs in renewable energy, and they're incredibly helpful and useful. If you ever get invited, I recommend strongly that you go.
We've paid all of them to say that.
Well, I actually think they're so good, I want you to have one on my golf game, because it's terrible, and I'm sure it could improve it dramatically. But thank you very much. What we've been doing essentially, and based on some of the work we've done in this lab and elsewhere, is we've set up the equivalent of a not-for-profit venture capital fund to drive community-based economic development using cultural heritage assets as the generating force. By way of one-sentence background, I think I'm the only card-carrying academic archaeologist who's been CEO of 3 public companies, so I approach preservation and economic issues a little bit differently than many of my more academic colleagues. And if you want to hear about how we started, there's a wonderful video online called Site Preservation for $50, in which I describe sort of the origin and the genesis of some of this, which we then worked through in the labs. But essentially what we do is we use these cultural heritage assets not as something that can be destroyed, looted, or used for agriculture, which has been the common economic use in many of these communities, but we use them as a generator for tourism, artisanal, and related businesses for economic activity, such that people have an economic reason not to destroy their site and can actually generate revenue from it. So if you put up slide 22, we like to sometimes say that it's really a two for the price of one model, that we're saving the heritage, but at the same time, what we're really focused on is providing these economic opportunities for the local communities. How do we do that? Slide 23. We empower local entrepreneurs. There are so many extraordinary, smart people in these poor communities. What they're missing is training, and what they're missing is access to capital, particularly equity capital. Those of you who deal with microfinance know that in general, it's short-term working capital debt. It's usually fairly high interest rate, though it's outstanding for a small period of time, such that you can afford to pay the absolute amount. But there is no equity, and I don't know about you, I've started a few companies and I'd have a hard time building one with a balance sheet that was 100% short-term working capital debt. And so what we're really trying to do here is empower and train these entrepreneurs, support them with equity. Now what we use all of the principles of a venture capital fund, other than we don't take the return. We vest all of the equity in the members of the communities who are active in the business. We can maybe talk later on about why we chose that initially as a return model. At some point in the future, I think we'll go to more hybrid models that involve perhaps returns as people grow. We then work with these communities to attract tourists at an appropriate scale and management, with appropriate management. One of the things that we've seen with too many development agencies is they want to build $1 million visitor center, and it doesn't matter if you're going to have 1 million tourists come or 5 tourists come, you're going to have $1 million center, and it's unsustainable by the local community. None of us would ever build a factory without thinking about how we're going to pay for electricity, labor, who's going to actually come and use it, and yet you have these massive centers being built. And so we're also working on creating exceptional experiences. If you go to page 24, slide 24. One of the things that's incredibly important to us is to be scalable. I'm going to leave that discussion because I know Caitlin wants to come back to it, but we try to measure profitability and returns, both economic, social, and preservation, and we have a series of metrics that do that. And focus not only on these big giant monuments. I mean, I've had the opportunity to excavate in Petra and work in Machu Picchu. They've got plenty of money. There are other issues in there, but there are so many sites and so many communities that have no economic development associated with them. If you go to slide 16, I want to discuss the results of our very first project, 16, sorry. That's actually the visitor center at our very first project, so that's good that you put that up. We funded this project with microequity, $40,000 in 2 years ago. Our first season revenues were $5,000. Second year was $11,000. So we're already starting to see the entrepreneurial spirit taking hold there. There were 20 temporary construction jobs. We started with 10 people working in this center, making a living from it. There are now 22 people. That's extraordinary job growth simply by providing people the kinds of trainings and capital that they don't have access to otherwise. And you can see we've now got institutional buy-in, but it's not just this. What it does is create a catalyst for other people to come in and be fascinated by this and drive it. So if you go to slide 17, thank you. We now have weavers. We didn't contemplate having weavers, but a local group of weavers said, can we participate in this center, utilize it, and get funded by you as well? Yes. We now have people who are doing cooking in their homes for tourists, providing a more authentic experience dining-wise for people in the communities. And it's also, there's other economic activity going on that has nothing to do with us. 2 small snack bars have just sprung up because they see tourists around and want to serve them. There's another, one of our lead products is making ceramic replicas of what's excavated in the archaeological site. A replica stand, having nothing to do with us, has popped up. It infuriates our artisans, but it secretly pleases me because it's a catalyst for economic activity. The last thing I'll mention is on slide 18. Government attitudes have changed. My archaeological colleague, Luis Jaime Castillo, who has worked at the site of San Jose de Moro, which if you have a chance to visit it, it's an amazing, amazing cemetery site in northern Peru, and I have lots of slides of it if anybody wants to see it. For 20 years, he says, the only thing he ever got from local and state government was a hard time. It was always like, we want to build something on top of your site, we want to put our road through the middle of it, and there was one for a while. Now, all of a sudden, they view archaeology and cultural heritage as this incredible driver of economic activity. They've constituted a tourist board, they've bought guidebooks for use by local businesses as well as in their schools. They're building a new entrance and putting signage up out on the main highway into the site because it's not necessarily easy to find. All of these kind of galvanizing community changes are leading to even more economic growth in the community. So by just a very, very small investment, what we've done is enable this community to completely transform itself both economically and in relationship to its cultural heritage.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point because it's shifting kind of the paradigm of bringing in investment capital and talking about it in a way that is investing in the communities as opposed to giving aid to the communities. And it's not just, well, the government is lacking in resources, so we can't really develop this site, or we just have to accept that there's a road in the center of it. It's that if you come in and you're talking about this as revenue generation and as an investment and as sustainability in terms of economic growth, then that changes the way that investors can come in, that foundations think about it, that governments think about it, and that's certainly the case. I think when you're talking about scale, and we certainly wanted to try to generate some controversy if we can. We like to stir up things at 8 o'clock this morning to talk about scale, because part of it, part of the problem challenges with innovative finance in particular is that investing in these products or in these sectors or in these markets has been traditionally perceived as too risky and potentially too small in terms of volume. And as Alice was mentioning, even domestically, banks are reluctant to lend unless the volume sizes can make up for the fact that there are operational costs. So the question, to the panel is how do you bridge the sort of gap between the time when something is truly scalable, because that time can be much later down the value chain. Certainly, the slide that Carrie showed about how far along you can be when you really need the upfront funding that David is talking about. You need that now. And so if the innovative finance needs to happen now, but donors and investors want it at a scale that is not sustainable at the moment but could be, how do you bridge that gap? I don't know, Larry, if you want to talk about that a little bit to kick it off.
Sure. No, it's a great question, and it's the one we are wrestling with, and I suspect a lot of people on the panel are probably wrestling with right now is, great, we think we've demonstrated a model that can work. We can do a certain number of projects a year. I don't feel the world needs another charity that does 2 or 3 projects a year. It needs ones that can do 20, 30, 50, 100 a year. And part of that is fundraising, part of that is continuing to generate opportunities that fit into the model. One of the things that we've been looking at is, I consider what we're doing both horizontal and vertical growth, and some of the vertical growth might be, horizontal means doing more projects in more communities. But the other thing that we now have is a group of deeply embedded entrepreneurs and advisors whom they trust, with whom we might be able to do continued amounts of social related and impact related investment or even action. So for example, Dean Kamen has invented this wonderful new machine to purify water. And in some of the communities that don't have it, we're looking to add those to our community centers on some kind of a market basis. It's not what we started out to do, but that's actually has an incredible impact at a much lower cost, as the machines run less than $10,000 on a community than I can by probably starting a new project. So what we're doing is taking our existing resources and maximizing them to the extent possible, while at the same time continuing the harder slog. The other thing we've started to do, Costa Rica, in order to kick off its ecotourism, which is now probably the best in the world, the government started a green bank, essentially, to fund ecotourism entrepreneurs. Small ones, give them long-term loans, some of which are forgivable on particular conditions, so that with a 10-year loan, people can pay that back even if they're earning small amounts every year. We're starting to talk about what I call common asset banks, as I want them to include ecotourism, cultural heritage assets, and other assets in the community within the countries in which we're working, in order to try to propel that forward, pointing to results like this and say, okay, let's do 10 projects together as a pilot. If that works, then next year let's do 100. So those are some of the methods that we've been doing. And it iterates a little bit on itself because when private donors get involved, more governments want to get involved. And as governments get more involved, of course, then private donors say, oh, this must be real. Let's go back to that.
Right. I mean, that's the point that Craig brought up in terms of having DFID come in, once there was a proven private sector partner, but then also the private sector coming in because of CDC and DFID's kind of stamp of approval.
Yeah.
I mean, in the ag space, there's certainly issues of scale, and you guys have been able, probably through aggregating, kind of smaller scale players, attract this type of institutional capital because because the scale has been slightly larger. How have you guys managed to bridge that gap?
I mean, we've looked at it as Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition is about, its mission is to improve nutrition and food insecurity. And there are different players, or different private sector players involved in that supply chain that I mentioned, from very small NGOs that have sell some institutional or give away institutional food to Danone and Britannia and Unilever. And so we, as an organization, engage with all of those players. So our view of scaling up is to have more capital there, and therefore more, different types of capital. So we work with an IFC. The IFC wouldn't look at, we did a project in Latin America where GAIN provides the technical assistance on there's a company in Ecuador called La Favorita that produces yogurt to the middle and upper classes, and they wanted to introduce a smaller package, long life UHT yogurt, fortified for young children and women of childbearing age. So GAIN worked on the product formulation, the marketing campaign, and we cost shared with the company. The IFC was there that once the project was ready to, there was a market that was viewed as a good opportunity, they were there to finance the packaging equipment that they needed to buy from Tetra Pak. So that's not going to, we're going to scale that up in the sense of there'll be more money for us to work together with the IFC. The IFC has a balance sheet to do that. So that's how we would deal with, say, medium regional sized companies. The fund that I'm talking about there is kind of the smaller, medium sized company. And then with the larger companies, at the end of the day, GAIN will work with its technical assistance with a Danone or a Britannia, and they've introduced yogurts and spreads and cookies and porridges globally, some of these companies. What we want to do is influence the capital markets to buy shares in those companies that are doing, producing better foods and practices. So I'll give you an example. So what do? We use a ranking, an index, and we just launched that 2 months ago. It's called the Access to Nutrition Index. It's funded by the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, where we basically looked at the best practices that companies in food and beverage manufacturers in the supply chain, largest 25 in the world, with India, Mexico, and South Africa sub-indices, where we've ranked them based on their performance of providing more accessible, affordable, appropriate foods. And we've done that through, it took 2 or 3 years, large stakeholders. We have, on the investor side, we have $4 trillion of assets under management signed up to this index. So the investor community was involved with the process, as well as governments, foundations, and other academics. So what that does is Danone ended up number 1, and then Unilever and Nestle down to 5 or 6 American companies as well. Basically, what that should do is those companies, those institutional investors will buy the shares in that company, increasing the price, lowering the cost of capital, making it easier for them to pursue those better practices. So that's the kind of scale we're interested in, scaling in different asset classes. So large institutional shareholders, all the way through to small microfinance type solutions. So that's how but it is an issue. We don't want to just have this private equity fund become a $50, $100 million fund. It needs to be larger, and given that, only 10 out of $100 any institution has can actually go into unlisted vehicles, we want to get into that $90 million vehicle. So we will be creating an investable index product when we do on this Access to Nutrition Index. We'll create a product once we have a larger cohort of companies, retailers, food service. You can imagine you just go up and down the supply chain, rank them on best practices. You can do many different structures. So.
I would ask Carrie or David, I think, because you guys have sort of the opposite challenge with scale in that your funding needs are significantly greater, but the potential capital coming from either donor governments or foundations is relatively small scale for what you need. So how do you guys kind of bridge that?
I think one of the ways that we're approaching it now is really looking at the market enhancing mechanisms, what we refer to as the pull mechanisms, which I had on the slide, which is really getting governments to understand what they're paying for today and what the long-term returns are on both what they want to accomplish in those, whether you're paying for TB control or you want to do prevention. You have to really make a really strong economic case. And then you want to help companies through de-risking mechanisms on the scientific side, which are the grant-making mechanisms, and then on the market-enhancing side, you want to basically help guarantee some of those markets. So when there is commercial opportunity, those companies have easy access. And Gavi actually is one of the ways where you looked at a pooled mechanism to, take 70-some countries, and you have a buyer for a very large, when you're looking at your supply, Gavi's an important purchaser there in helping to capture some of that market, even if the margins are low. So I think it's really understanding, the way I see it is, scalability is not really the issue, it's really an alignment of the right financial instruments at the right time in the value chain. And really taking a diverse perspective to how you look at financing both, where you're trying to achieve your social outcomes along with your financial outcomes. And it's a perspective issue as much as it is anything else.
And I don't know, David, if you've, in terms of the Gavi matching fund, to Craig's point about how you engage the private sector, have you guys found that this is a concern of theirs, that they don't want, to use your term, to have pilotitis, of just having a pilot case and not kind of going any farther than that? How have you worked around those challenges?
So the first thing I would say is, scale is not always an issue. I mean, there is a place for small. There are lots of places for small. Legitimately. But if scale is an issue, and in our world it often is because we operate globally, then you either have to start big, so that's IFM, or you start small and then your hope is that it will grow up to be big. The issue about the latter is that I think that to avoid pilotitis, you need a testable hypothesis about how you grow from small to big. I think this is not a world in which you're placing 1,000 bets and you hope that one of them grows up in Darwinian fashion to become eBay or Amazon. That's not the world we're operating in. So we can certainly stand failure and we should celebrate failure. But for us, when it comes to something like the Gavi Matching Fund, I mentioned to you the example of Vodafone. Mm-hmm. So the good news for Gavi is we've got a global platform. We operate in 73 countries. If something works in one, we can take it elsewhere. Right. And so in the case of that example, we have a pilot, but the pilot itself is pretty big. It's across an entire country. But if it works there, we have, as I said, we have a hypothesis about testing ourselves on the way to see whether we're on track and off track. And if we're off track, we have to take it on the chin and say, it didn't work out as planned. We've got to do something differently or call a time out. If it's on track, then we have agreed, we've baked in to the deal an agreement to proceed to other countries. So I think it's about that testable hypothesis and having a flight path to scale rather than thinking you always have to start big. But in certain contexts, in the IFM context, it made sense to start big.
Or you can just bring Larry on your road show so that you're always relatively larger scale than what he is. Alice, I don't know how in terms of your new position, how you guys are addressing these issues, especially in education, as you were talking about earlier, that can be a challenge in terms of scale.
Well, I agree very much with what people said about you should really dig down a bit and find out what you mean by scale. Mm-hmm. And there's very big differences between organizations that purchase, goods on a global market, Gavi, and organizations that fund a collection of local service deliveries, which have different dimensions in terms of how they're funded. In many ways, it has to be very domestic. But there are opportunities for scale within education, and I'm not so much talking about buying zillions of books out there and getting them to every poor country, because there are language problems, there's delivery problems. But there are other types of opportunities for scale within education. One is advocacy. One is there are going to be some financing opportunities that are scalable. One, we're going to start looking at innovative financing within GPE, and there are the types of mechanisms that would make more sense are, like product red types of ideas that look at, a broad set of, financial transactions, for example, or the FTT tax.
Right.
That is a scaled financial mechanism that you can then use to, to put it in simple terms, chop the proceeds of that up into little pieces to then fund what are then ultimately very different domestic endeavors.
Right.
But I think, something that Carrie said I think was very true, which is that you have to look at the business case behind a lot of these innovative financing endeavors. You can't just walk in and say, I want to do innovative financing because it's cool.
Right.
We've gone beyond that, I think. But we were guilty of that, a number of years ago. What you really have to ask yourself the question of is, what is the economic and the macro and the business case for doing one of these things? Is it going to enhance delivery? Is it going to lower cost? Is it going to make a technology available that otherwise wasn't available? Is it going to fill a market gap that is created by lack of financing? Is it going to does it create the opportunity for bulk purchasing, for example? It has to make sense in the context of what is the endeavor itself, and then you look at the financial mechanisms, as opposed to saying, oh, I want to issue bonds. Okay, how are we going to do that? You guys wouldn't be issuing bonds. But so you have to really think about it first, what's the problem that you're trying to solve?
Right.
And then try to solve it, as opposed to walking in with lots of solutions and saying, okay, let's go find a problem.
Right. and should be catalytic, to Carrie's point earlier, I
Yes.
think, in terms of what the funding is actually doing. And not to just talk about the challenges, we also want to talk about opportunities. So to the panel, talking about kind of what's next. Certainly, not creating something just to create it, but if you all had kind of a parting word to the audience before we ask for questions, where do you think this trend of innovative finance is going, and how can more people become engaged in the process in a constructive way, to Alice's point?
I'm not sure there's a trend specifically, although I agree with Alice that we've moved on from solutions looking for problems, and that's great. I think for Gavi, as I was saying at the top of the hour, a big part of our business model is about implementing developing countries taking on more and more of the burden of funding vaccines, in our case, and health systems. And so I think for us, kind of the next generation, the movie that is coming relatively soon, is working with a number of those developing countries to look at their own approach to innovative finance. And I think there are some very interesting opportunities there, partly to transpose some of the models that we've spoken about here today, but partly also to build on local habits, institutions, resources. I mean, last week I was traveling around, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and the opportunities there are just, and the history around things like philanthropy and development and investment are just quite different from opportunities elsewhere, and very exciting. And I think one of the things in that region that was amazing to see was how engaged people are becoming in development, in large-scale philanthropy, and in thinking globally, thinking about issues like health and indeed education in a global way rather than a local or regional way. So I think a lot of our opportunities are going to be, I think if we come back in a couple of years' time, that'll be a very interesting subject of discussion, and we'll be doing some interesting things.
Yeah.
If I can just build off that, I think this is largely an issue of vision. If you hear Mike Milken talk about all the money and what the returns are and where the uncommitted capital is and how do you make $1 today, it's hard to make $1, right? And we see this happening right in the purest form of capitalism. At the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the development space to look for those opportunities to be better capitalists and stop thinking about this as a social issue that simply is funded by philanthropic dollars. So the more that we can bring the world into a vision, that there's money to be made, in a lot of these areas that we haven't really figured out yet, I think will drive a lot of innovation just through the financial markets and through the opportunities that are there. And so a lot of it really is a sector-based segmentation issue where we say, well, this is a social issue, and so we're going to put it over here and ask the public sector to solve that problem. And this is where we want to go for our returns. And it's really not about diluting returns so much as it is seeing where the opportunities are. And I think that's where the world needs to come together, and I think Milken has done a great job at really trying to pull the two sectors together to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, as you can see from the conference and the program itself, is the amount of impact investing, the conversation about impact investing, finding a social and financial return. I mean, Craig, I know you're working with impact investors. Is that kind of the next frontier for what you're trying to do in the developing countries as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, it definitely. I mean, there's a vast amount of money in domestic pension funds, if you want to look at that. And I'm working with another organization. I've worked with GAIN and continue. The next move for GAIN would be the projects the fund that we have with LGT, the listed products, the index product that we'll be constructing in the next few years. Those are all built off of piloting the theme that you could invest. There are solutions to invest in nutrition and food security. And so we have a procurement credit facility as well at GAIN, and the next move for GAIN is to scale that up. It's going to be the Nutrition Credit Fund. Basically, it's a working capital facility. So that's an interesting part for GAIN. The other work that I've noticed is there was in innovative finance this trend at first to look at voluntary contribution mechanisms and to look at taxes and levies and the financial transactions. That's good for them. That's gone through, but. I was personally skeptical originally, but I think it's fantastic. But my area is more investable solutions, and so yeah, I'm working with one organization that it's the only UN organization that can do loans and has a track record of loans and grants in country, and we're looking at the domestic pension funds to tap into those because we've had some partnerships there. So it's pretty exciting that actually. And then on a thematic basis, instead of approaching some international organizations that I work with on. This is a way to take a percentage of the fee to generate resources, right, off of some financial instrument. It's how do these things address your constraints or reduce your costs? And these are the issues that I'm working with a couple of humanitarian organizations on, and those will be around procurement structures, guarantee facilities. Hopefully they'll have them investable for, in a sense, institutional intent, those type of investors. Of course, they'll have opportunities for bilaterals and PR foundation investors to come in. So it's really, there's a lot of thematic interest.
And that's exciting to have some of the more investable products coming forward, which is exciting. I know we're going to be running out of time, so I just wanted to see if there were questions in the audience. Andrew? Yes.
Great panel. Thank you, Caitlin. I just had a question for you because I think it's, from what we've heard, the landscape is obviously changing, and from a government standpoint, it's just not aid over here, trade over here. It's really coming together, and we're asking, as a funder, funded by the Government of Canada, and so we're asking our innovators to innovate. We're asking NGOs and private sector partners and actors to innovate. But my question to you is, how should government-funded agencies like Grand Challenges Canada, USAID, DFID, how should we innovate? Because I've been arguing that if we're asking everyone else around us to innovate, we need to innovate on our own. And I don't think we're doing a good job, to be honest. And I think we need to adapt as the environment is adapting as well. So give me some advice. What should we do?
Alice, I was going to say Alice,
you have one of the most innovative export credit agencies in the world in Canada, Export EDC. In fact, I led 2 trips up there to go and study all the stuff that they're doing because they're remarkable. I grappled with this exact question for 3.5 years at the Export-Import Bank, and I'm about to start grappling it with ministries of education. I think and if one was to generalize, and it's hard, the policy-making process and the government budgeting and scoring process happens at a glacial pace and is often decades behind how the world is operating. And so if you were to really try to crack the nut, you would do it along those lines. And trade and aid are a fascinating example, and in particular if you look at China, The OECD was sort of the governing body of trade finance since, probably, right after World War II, a long time basically. And it has put trade and aid in extremely different buckets. Aid is grant money, and trade is meant to be financed at market levels. It just simply fills gaps where private sector is not there. Although there's increasingly some exceptions to that. China, but it separates trade aid, very separate. China has looked at that dichotomy and said, well, we're not a member of the OECD. By the way, we're not a democracy. We don't really care about the OECD. We are going to go and engage with a lot of African countries on a trade basis in a way that blends trade and aid. They need money, we need their cobalt, they need infrastructure, we can do that. And it just shows that if a government is prepared to think about things in a policy perspective very differently, things can be changed. Now, I would encourage you to look at EDC. EDC is probably the most successful export credit agency within the OECD context in terms of innovation. And the reason for that is because the Canadian government is prepared to be very laid forward on what is the role of government. They're not afraid to try new things. They're prepared to think about, I think a false dichotomy increasingly is government and private sector ways of doing things are very different, very taboo, never talk to each other, sorry. EDC has broken that model. So I think you have a very good model to look at right up there in Ottawa. They're great people up there.
You have a very I would say you have to redefine success. And I think part of it is the metrics that we use to define success that really limits innovation. So, you have to, people want short-term solutions, they want to buy into an outcome, and we have to really change the goalposts if we want to think differently. And that's the hardest change to make in the policy environment because, the ambiguity is sort of hard to sell and to put your money on innovation as a platform is tough. But I think we can make a good case that we've been spending a lot of money and we're not really getting the returns that we want, which is why we're having this conversation today.
I think you also just need to have pots of money specifically dedicated to innovation because, I go to talk to USAID and they want to know where my $1 million visitor center is. Yeah. And I can talk till I'm blue in the face that I don't do $1 million. And they go, well, do you want to consult on one? And I go, no, I'd like you to do $20,000, $50,000. But it's a serious problem because people get very entrenched in their prior paradigms and then can never move beyond what those are to try the kinds of things that people on this panel are talking about.
And I think on that note, our session is over. So please join me in thanking the panelists. Very, very interesting conversations. Stick around if you have some more questions. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer it. So thank you, everyone, for coming out.